the convention for one thing: to solve the crisis of the Confederation. The delegates followed their instructions because they wrote a document that tempered the competitive nature of states and used their roles as trustees to expand on the instruction of state legislatures.
The founders successfully created a government designed to funnel self-interest for the good of the Union. As historian Charles Beard wrote, "The bee fertilizes the flower it robs." For example, they created auxiliary precautions like the separation of powers that ensure limited government. In a confederacy, states act like factions and compete with one another, such as New York and Pennsylvania taxing trade heading to New Jersey. Today, we see the Constitution is able to channel this competition, upholding good government in the face of not just competing states, but a hyper-partisan two-party system.
Additionally, the convention used the trustee model to create deliberation. Rather than blindly following their instructions to a fault, the delegates refined them. According to political theorist David Miller, the more deliberative the communication, the better democracy works. Representatives takes the interest of the voters, in this case, the state legislatures, and create something new that will benefit the common good.
Under their new state constitutions, states face the burden of debt and a sluggish economy because of a lack of central authority to levy taxes and enforce trade policy.
Only state governments had the power to tax, meaning Congress was unable to pay Revolutionary veterans. In Massachusetts, these debts resulted in Shays' Rebellion. Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 1 and 15 fixed this by giving Congress the power to tax and fight insurrections.
Additionally, a lack of central control led to a breakdown of interstate commerce. Tough state tariffs, large states teaming up against small states, and interstate conflict made for a sluggish, inefficient national economy. The framers addressed this problem in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, which gave Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce.
The Supreme Court is an ongoing constitutional convention because while it does not structurally alter the document, it clarifies and legitimizes the text, changing meaning over time. Court cases can both add meaning, such as the penumbra doctrine, and negate meaning, depending on the ideological leaning of the court.
Revolutionary cases like Roe v. Wade draw out constitutional law not explicitly enumerated. Following Griswold v. Connecticut, the right to contraceptives, and by extension abortion, is a right to privacy. According to Cornell Law School, the cases suggest that specific guarantees in the Bill of Rights have penumbras. While the Constitution doesn't include any trace of contraception, the court acts as a convention by substantiating those rights.
The court also has the power to negate the meaning of the Constitution. In 1905, Lochner v. New York established that the 14th Amendment protected against federal laws that sought to regulate business. This was overturned in West Coast Hotel v. Parrish. Court shifted from conservative to liberal as the nation did. The 14th Amendment then can be negated depending on the context in which the court sits.
Regardless of changes made through Congress, convention, or courts, the Constitution must change as we do. As Thomas Jefferson put it, laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As it becomes more enlightened, as new discoveries are made, institutions must advance also to keep pace with the times. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And please put your notes away. So let me ask you first about the provocative position that you took that the Supreme Court is an ongoing constitutional convention and that it needs to be. But what about the challenge that this was not a constitutional way of altering the Constitution? So is this actually a usurpation of the power of the Supreme Court?
While judicial review might not be specifically enumerated in the Constitution, we see in Federalist 78 that Hamilton talks about the role of the Supreme Court and their role of judicial review. Because they interpret the Constitution, they must assign meaning to the Constitution.
To build off that point, we can...
Really quickly, a follow-up question. Is judicial review the same thing as changing the meaning of the Constitution?
I believe it is. We can see that Brutus actually wrote about this in Brutus 15, saying that the judicial review allows for the judiciary to interpret the laws and change the meaning of the Constitution. We can actually see this placating in the United States v. Miller decision, which reinterpreted the Second Amendment and actually put gun control legislation on that point.
When looking at a case like Dred Scott v. Sanford and then going to Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court certainly redefines the Constitution within the context of that time, because it protects people differently, evolving with the social norms of that time. So therefore, the Supreme Court is an ongoing constitutional convention because it clarifies and legitimizes everything within the document based on that time period.
If that's the position, then why is there an amendment process? I thought the amendment process was how to change the Constitution.
While the amendment process structurally alters the document, having this ability to shape it regarding time with judicial review allows for evolving change. Since the amendment process is so difficult to overturn, for example, the only example that we see is with the 21st Amendment making the 18th Amendment void. It's important to have that judicial review process in order to conform with the times and have a quicker moving process to deliver on the public good.
Additionally, we have to look at the history of the amendments and understand that the amendments were more of a paper idea. We can see this through the Alien Sedation Acts with the First Amendment, that not all the amendments were utilized. And we can actually see this throughout all of history, that different amendments have different meanings. We can look at the 14th Amendment and its applications in Citizens United, or the 14th Amendment and its applications in Lochner v. New York.
We also know that even though the court acts as a convention, there are certain limitations on what it can act on, like the political question doctrine, meaning the court can't get involved in cases where there's purely executive authority, purely legislative authority, such as in cases of political gerrymandering.
Okay, thank you.
I want to ask this unit, shifting gears a little bit, what you said the words fix the crisis of the Confederacy or Confederation. What were the key failures that created the crisis of the Confederation, and was the remedy appropriate?
One major issue that we saw during the Confederation was an emphasis on state power. While states should certainly have a say within the federal government, there should be a strong central authority enforcing this. For example, there was an executive council that would meet very rarely under the Articles of Confederation. So therefore, by fixing this through the Constitution, establishing federal supremacy with Article 6, Clause 2, and the Supremacy Clause, we gained that federal supremacy, which has been more and more important with the geographic and political growth of the nation.
We can look at Article 9 of the Article of Confederation that allowed states to coin their own money. And we can understand that interstate commerce at that time was one of the biggest issues, and understand that that influenced different things such as Shays' Rebellion and Dorr's Rebellion, because this economic burden and these economic debts were placating in different ideas at that time.
If we look today, we can see the state-to-state conflict over the need for masks and ventilators. And back in the day in the Confederacy, there was no sort of solution to that. States would be fighting for one another, bidding for those ventilators. Today, we have the National Defense Production Act, and if the federal government chooses to act on it, they can distribute those evenly to the states without those factions in place.
Okay, let me ask you about something else you said in the opening statements, that the delegates functioned as a kind of trustee when representing their states. So were the states the only constituents that they had? And what were their obligations, even if you looked at the trustee model?
We can understand this idea with this idea that representatives must be able to truly represent their people. We can look at a Madisonian ideal and representation to understand that people must be able to put their trust in the government, and understand that Blackstone actually wrote about this, that the government is the will of the people and the government must reflect their ideas.
Unfortunately, the common good often contrasts with the popular view. So therefore, with the trustee model established in the Constitutional Convention, it was very important because at that time, with the crisis of the Confederation period, many states simply wanted to alter the initial articles instead of creating a new document. However, with that system of state supremacy, and the ability to coin their own taxes, coin their own money, it was very important for that national supremacy to step in.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Good job, Nevada. Or is it
Thank you.
Nevada?
Nevada.
All right. I think that you guys did a great job. You had a really strong opening statement, and you were also obviously very well prepared to spar with us in the Q&A. I loved the example of the face masks and being able to apply that as one of the advantages of overcoming some of the problems that the articles had presented. I did question a little bit the use of Brutus and anti-federalists for defending the use of the courts as a constitutional convention. Brutus, of course, warned that the courts might change the meaning of the Constitution, but did not say that it was a legitimate part. Even the anti-federalists did not say that it was a legitimate part of the Constitution. And I also just questioned the idea that the use of judicial review was just simply the same thing as the courts changing the meaning of the Constitution. I don't think that would be the position of Alexander Hamilton or Justice Marshall. So I thought that you were skirting history a little bit when you seem to be putting that doctrine into their mouths. But overall, I thought this was a really strong round, and I thought obviously you guys are immersed in this literature. So good job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sometimes it's important to hear different teams' approach to the subject, and I was quite pleased with what I heard from you. I enjoyed it. Wanted really to ask you, especially given how much reliance you put on the directions of state legislatures, do we need to talk about Rhode Island? Because they had some directions too, and theirs was simple. We're not coming here because you're cheating and we're not going to do it right. And isn't there a point that we have to talk about them in terms of this? Because if you take 9 out of the 10 people who said Lindsey's a good dude, that doesn't mean somebody in there going, do y'all know him well? So I really enjoyed it, missed that point, liked the citations that you gave. Really, I'm still working through how I want to feel about your dealing with the amendment process, but enjoyed it very much. Very good job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciated this, and one of the I want to affirm and agree with my colleagues in their assessments. I think you were ready to spar, and that is actually very good, because then you keep it fast and quick, and that was interesting. And clearly we wound up talking about the court a lot, and that was either by design or by accident. So you're either very good at sneakiness or manipulation, or we took the bait, whatever. That's why I wanted to talk a little bit more about what was the crisis, and what I wanted to hear a little bit more of was how what exigent meant. How bad was it? How critical was the issue? And where I would have to kind of draw some inference was when you mentioned the economic issues and the lack of the interstate trade and stuff like that turned into violence. That's interesting, because what we're looking for generally is when should the government use its police power to do things? And emergencies is one where we expect the government to do things for the greater good. And the question that is looming with this particular question is, was the convention that, and so I wanted to hear a little bit more on that topic, but clearly you got my juices flowing, and a mark of a good team is when we're chomping at the bit, we got more questions, and we could talk about this for forever. So good job from the great state of Nevada.
Good job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job. Okay.